we go. The world of deep silence. Is that mic on?
Mic's not on.
Mic's not on. The world of deep silence. The Voice of the Silence was Madame Blavatsky's last and most profound book. It was derived, or she derived it, from the book of the Golden Precepts, from which also was derived the stanzas of Jan, which are at the start of the Secret Doctrine. It is also the most profound book that Blavatsky wrote. She selected these particular verses from the fragment, obviously with a great deal of insight and imagination. And this was the great mystic work called the Paramartha, which I guess is largely lost today because many people have sought to find the stanzas of Jan in their original origin, where she got them from, and haven't found them. Now, in looking at this whole subject of silence, in the Voice of the Silence, there is, of course, the tremendous role of consciousness. And I want to start off by reading you some words that Geoffrey Farthing wrote in his book Deity, Cosmos and Man, because it's all about this subject of consciousness and our senses. Each of our 7 physical senses, he writes, 2 of which are still unknown to profane science, and also of our 7 states of consciousness, that is, waking dreaming, or which I call daydreaming, natural sleep, induced or trance sleep, psychic, superpsychic, and purely spiritual. They correspond with each of the 7 cosmic planes, and they develop using one of the 7 supersenses. And they are connected directly in their use on the terrestrial spiritual plane with the cosmic and divine centre of force that gave them birth, and which is its creator. Each is also connected and under the direct influence of one of the 7 sacred planets. And that part is a quotation from Volume 3 of the Secret Doctrine. Geoffrey Farthing writes, this passage is preceded by a warning against misplaced reliance on either the physical or the psychic senses in what concerns the higher planes. And so in this study this morning, we're going to look at exactly that, exactly what I've just read. Let me read it again. This passage is preceded by a warning against misplaced reliance on either the physical or the psychic senses in what concerns the higher planes. And in order to reach this state of deep silence, we need to look at how we access these higher planes. And so he writes, or she writes rather, again in Volume 3, remember that with our physical senses alone at our command, none of us can hope to reach beyond gross matter. We can do so only through one or another of our 7 spiritual senses, either by training, if one is a born seer, yet even a clairvoyant possessed of such faculties, if not an adept, no matter how honest and sincere he may be, will, through his ignorance of the truths of occult science, be led by visions he sees in the astral light, only to mistake for God or angels the denizens of those spheres of which he may occasionally catch a glimpse, as witness Swedenborg and others. Because this is the case again and again with people who have some psychic ability. They think that they are seeing much deeper into the planes of the subjective planes that lie behind the physical than they actually are. And this famous quotation, which eludes me just for the moment, which you remember, about the stairway of the 7 steps, and each getting deeper and murkier as you go down into the depths of physical incarnation. Which leads me directly on, talking about the principles, to talking about the individuality and the personality. Now, you know, all of you, I think, in the European school, you don't need me to labour the point about the 7 principles of man and the 7 planes of the cosmos, because we've talked about them so many times. But this division of the 7 into the individuality and the personality is crucial in this particular study, because it deals with this point in the Voice of the Silence, which deals between the self and the self. And you know how she makes this tremendous play in the Voice of the Silence between self, spelt with a capital S, sometimes spelt in all capitals, and the self smalt in the lowercase letters. Trying to draw a distinction between the individuality and the personality. Now, it's only where the individuality is involved that we can approach the world of deep silence. As long as we stay in our personality, that world of deep silence is totally blocked and inaccessible to us. And once again, let me just, at the very beginning of this study, say to you, of course, that the self can only communicate with the self in silence. And I hope to explain that statement a little bit more as we go through this study. Now, one of the difficult words in theosophy, which everyone has to master sooner or later, is the word antakarana. And some of you have lived with it for years and you know it very well, and others perhaps still a bit dodgy when it comes to spelling it. But it is being described in a number of ways. It's been described as a bridge. It's been described as the lower manas, where the 5th principle of man is divided into 2 parts. The lower part being called lower manas, and the upper part being called the buddhi, the upper manas, which is so closely linked to buddhi. And this bridge is a bridge which is part of a road. And this bridge has got to be crossed to find the world of deep silence. The first time I became aware that I was a self and a small self and a big self, to use a rather rough abbreviation, was when I was about 18 or 19. The parish priest had said, well, he said, I want to organise a retreat for the parish, and I'd like as many people to come on it as possible. And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I've never been on a retreat in my life before, I'll go on a retreat. So I signed up for it. What I didn't really, perhaps I wasn't paying attention enough when I heard about this retreat. What I didn't realise was that from tea time on Friday to tea time on Sunday, there was to be so total silence. I had never ever gone into a situation like that in my life before. And as I proceeded through a totally, completely and utterly silent Saturday, I began to be more and more aware of myself. And even to this day, some 50-odd years later, I can still remember the extraordinary effect that this silent weekend's retreat had upon me. Because I discovered that I was a self and I was another self. I discovered that there was a duality about me which I'd never ever suspected before. And it just completely threw me to have an experience like this that I was totally unexpected to have. And so when I came to Theosophy and I started studying Theosophy, I really did have something to go on. It wasn't just a piece of theory, this business in the voice of the silence, of there being to a self and a self. But it was something that I could look back on in my life and relate to. Anyway, so much for that. I hope that all of you who are here have had a similar experience, because if you have had that experience, then this won't be a piece of theory that I'm talking about this morning. It will be a statement of your own personal pilgrimage and spiritual life. Now, one of the things that the voice of the silence goes into is the question, is the start of it, is the 3 halls. In fact, there are 4 halls, not 3 halls, but it's called 3 halls, because the 4th hall is described as the world, and you start off with this concept of the world, and then you move into this. It's called the Hall of Sorrow, this first world, and then we have the other halls, which, let me read you from the actual text itself, because it's such a beautiful text. The name of the first hall is ignorance, avidya. Well, we all have to start there, don't we? We all have to start in the hall of ignorance. There's none of us that can miss out that hall as we enter the path. We'll talk a lot more about the path later on. It is the hall in which thou sawest the light, in which thou livest, and shalt die. The name of the hall, the second, is the hall of learning. In it thy soul will find the blossoms of life, but under every flower a serpent coiled. Now, what does that imagery mean? If you look up the notes on the voice of the silence, you read that this is the heresy of separateness. Because all the time you're in sort of the academic mode, you're inclined to go the analytical path. We've all been trained in this analytical path right from the beginning of our school days, and immediately we're confronted with any sort of problem, we immediately start to analyse it and break it down into its components. And what is being said here, and of course it looks very wonderful to us, it's a beautiful technique. It enables us to get hold of the reality that surrounds us in our lives and make sense of it by breaking it down in order to understand the bits and then putting it all together again. And it is a beautiful flower, the blossom of life, in fact. But under it is this serpent coiled, because unless we actually put it all together and realise that the teachings of Theosophy are so true, that there is an underlying unity beneath everything, then it will completely foil us and stop us in the path. And then the name of the 3rd hall is wisdom, beyond which stretch the shoreless waters of Akashra, the indestructible fount of omniscience. And then it goes on to say about what happens when you try and cross these halls. And I can never stop myself from thinking about the analogy of the Great Hall when I read about these halls in the voice of the silence. There's this analogy given of our lives, of a great barn, a huge great barn, in which there is a banquet going on. And at one end of the barn, you may have heard this before, there is a small hole in the gable, and a little bird flies in. And all this from the darkness, and all this feasting and merriment is going on downstairs on the floor of the barn. A great feast and celebration. And this little bird flies right through the barn and passes by all this merriment and all this feasting, and eventually it goes out to the hole in the gable at the other end of the barn, into the darkness again. And I get this picture in my mind as I think about these halls that are described in The Voice of the Silence, because they're a part of the path, and part of the path which goes, in my view, across the bridge of Antakarana, between the self and the self, or between the personality and the individuality. Now, why did I start off by reading these words that Geoffrey had put in his book about consciousness? It's because as we traverse these various aspects of the path that go through these halls, over these bridges, which is very appropriate for Venice, isn't it? Halls and bridges. We go through different levels of consciousness in ourselves. When we're really hungry or thirsty, of course our consciousness is totally focused in our physical bodies, and at other times too, if we hurt ourselves. If we're enjoying a wonderful meal, we tend to be focused in our physical bodies. There are all sorts of examples I could give about that, couldn't I? I'm sure you can think of many as well, where our consciousness is really totally there. If we're studying for an examination and we're desperate to get a good mark in the exam, we are totally focused within our minds. We're trying desperately to take hold of our minds and focus them completely, our consciousness totally in the mind, so that we can make the very best of our studies. And so this question of consciousness and principles is critical in our understanding of the way in which the whole process works. Now, Mabel Collins, as you probably know, wrote a book called Light on the Path. And she throws a number of ideas at us in the course of this book. And some of them I've extracted for purposes of this talk because it helps to expand our understanding. She writes, "For within you is the light of the world, the only light that can be shed upon the path. If you are unable to perceive it within yourself, it is useless to look for it elsewhere. It is beyond you, because when you reach it, you have lost yourself. It is unattainable, because it ever recedes. You will enter the light, but you will never touch the flame." Then later on she writes, "Having obtained the use of the inner senses, having conquered the desires of the outer senses, having conquered the desires of the individual soul, and having obtained knowledge, prepare now, O disciple, to enter upon the way in reality. The path is found. Make yourself ready to tread it." And then she becomes even more enigmatic. She says, "Hold fast to that which is neither substance nor existence. Listen only to the voice which is soundless. Look only on that which is invisible alike to the inner and outer sense." Then she says, "To all who are interested seriously in occultism, I say first take knowledge. To him who hath shall be given. It is useless to wait for it. The womb of time will close before you, and in later years you will remain unborn, without power. I say therefore to those who have any hunger or thirst for knowledge, attend to these rules. They are none of my handicraft or invention. They are merely the phrasing of laws in supernature, the putting into words truths as absolute in their own sphere as those laws which govern the earth and its atmosphere. Now, back in 1999, Geoffrey Farthing wrote a book which he didn't have printed. He had it produced in a ring binder form, and this book was called Extrapolations. It was a book he wrote based upon his reactions to a book which had been written some time previously by David Lorimer of the Scientific and Medical Network. You may have heard of David Lorimer, all of you. And this book was called The Spirit of Science. And of course David Lorimer has his own view on all these things, and it stimulated Geoffrey to write this quite substantial document. And Geoffrey picks up verses and makes a commentary on them, and this commentary is so perceptive that I would like you to listen to Geoffrey's words here. And the quote that he takes from David Lorimer's book is, "I want to speak today of this non-dualism, starting, of course, where we all are in this fragmented universe." And this is what Geoffrey wrote. In the notes introducing this lecture are the words, "The unity in truth, which is the goal of all religions." We have already discussed the idea of unity. There are two ways of regarding it. One as the common source of all that is, manifest or otherwise, and the other as the sum total of all existence, in the sense of all that exists. According to esoteric science, this unity is realizable in consciousness as the highest meditative state during which the meditator feels himself to have merged in consciousness, not only with all that is, but with its very heart, the inmost centre of being. In this state, he knows that there is nothing else. This state of unity is the very acme of non-dualism, but it transcends all thought. Thinking necessarily involves a subject and an object. Division, which is what the generality of us can accept. The ultimate unity must be a matter of postulation and conjecture at personal level. It is only realizable at the egoic level by the divine, immortal individuality. So there Geoffrey is pointing right to the end of the road, right to the very end of the road, where there is the deepest silence, where there is the deepest penetration into the awareness of the fundamental underlying unity of existence. I'd love to read you a lot more of this book because it really is a fascinating book that Geoffrey wrote. I'll come back to just a bit of it in a moment, because I want to switch to another book which I think some of you have bought off the bookstall during the school this week, called The Search Within by Christmas Humphreys. Because Christmas Humphreys was on exactly the same theme that I'm on this morning when he wrote this book. And there are all sorts of incredible gems in this book. I mean, it is a most amazing book. I'm not surprised they disappeared off the bookstall so quickly today, this week. And I thought I would read you something that he wrote himself, in which he tries in a poetic way to get beyond the words, to grasping hold of this subtlety that lies behind our ordinary waking consciousness and understanding of ourselves. And he calls this poem Thoughts on Self. The self is a folly of the thinking mind, a thing thought made, and we are blind in our imagining. The fool, raising a seeking head, perceives and yearns with red desire. Hands follow, craving to acquire, and grasp themselves already dead. Be humble and remain entire. The self extruding from the whole, with knives of separation damns the soul. You remember what I said about the serpent coiled? With knives of separation damns the soul. The self is naught, a puppet filled with fear, a swimmer set to violate the stream, a voice the wakened self must learn to bear, or wake the dreamer from his foolish dream. The universe is total, whole of will, unblemished harmony, and we, essential through eternity, are still unsevered parts of void totality. Self, spelled with capital letters. Self is. The self, small letters, awake yet torn, strives riven-hearted to let fall the weight of difference. The all is partless, absolute, unborn. O self, that self in self would die, that self of all distinction free might slay forever, joyously, the fond, offensive thought of I. And very appropriately, I come back to Geoffrey. He picks up this point exactly. He says, he picks up these words from David Lama's book. He says, we're all being led beyond that mortal dualism, that deathly concept of mortal dualism, into the transcendent. And this is what Geoffrey says about that. And talking about the particular point that we quoted, he says, Griffith here goes on to say that Jesus came to lead humanity out of the law. Understood in the light of esoteric science, this obviously cannot be. What he is referring to is the canon law of the Jewish scripture. This does not relate to natural law. Griffith goes on to say that Jesus was taking us out of the law, out of this moral religion, to the religion of love, the religion of graces. Most of us, Geoffrey goes on, appreciate what the religion of love is. At the very least, it is the basis for right relationships between all human beings. There will be many, however, who will not understand what the religion of grace is. Many would construe it to mean some kind of blessing from on high with redemptive potency. If this cannot be understood in terms of esoteric science, it would mean that the aspirant has by some means begun to build the bridge of Antakarana between his personal self and his egoic divine self, his immortal self. This process, Geoffrey says, is not only enlightening, but also redemptive. The redemption, however, will not necessarily come as many may have imagined or perhaps hoped. We have previously mentioned karma. The man, having invoked his egoic self, has put himself on the path to final redemption. Most of us have considerable karmic debts which we cannot escape. We have to settle them before our ultimate release is possible. In the light of this consideration, all those of us who are seriously on the path of spiritual development must be aware of what we are doing. Many teachers will not mention this price we have to pay. Even if they are aware of it, it seems that most are not. It would perhaps be invidious to attempt to relate much of what Griffiths says in many passages in his lecture to the esoteric viewpoint. His points are related very closely to ideas in conventional religion and scripture. By and large, in places, the words point towards the same horizon as that of esoteric science, but they tend to be personalized. The horizon of esoteric science is as far as consciousness itself can reach, liberated from personal limitations. It is quite boundless and attainable only by what Griffiths refers to as consciousness of the One, the unity of the whole universe. He also refers to freedom. The freedom envisaged, says Geoffrey, by esoteric science is freedom from any kind of limitation whatever. It is impossible to visualize or to use any simile to describe it, because this freedom does not relate to conditioned existence at all. There is a significant saying of Jesus that in his service is perfect freedom. His service means, in esoteric terms, the total abandonment of one's personal self to the universal life process, in whatever way we as individuals might be involved in it. Now, if the end of the road is this merging with the One, this total abandonment of one's personal self in favour of the awareness of the fundamental underlying unity of all existence, what in fact is this One? Is it in fact something which we can have any regard for at all? The whole of the problem with us is that we want to take hold of something that is imaginable. This is why anthropomorphism is such a popular thing in the world's religions, because people must have an image of something in their minds, it would seem. And yet this is the one thing that all these things that I've been quoting to you from is the one thing you have to abandon and get rid of in order to reach the true depth and the true silence. And I'm really grateful to Michael for bringing this book. He donated it to the school, and there are a few copies left on the bookstall at a remarkably low price, which is a series of lectures or articles written especially, I'm told, to be presented to Ted Davey on his 75th birthday. But the second or third of these articles, I've forgotten how far through the book I actually read to get to this. This particular writer, a man called, David Regal, has tackled the first fundamental proposition. Now, I was talking to somebody in the school this week who was really quite hazy about the fundamental propositions. And I was quite astonished because I really thought that we'd hammered home these things for so long in the school that nobody could be in any doubt about what they were. And it's because we're all at different parts of the learning curve, aren't we? And some of us tend to assume when we get to a certain point on the learning curve that everybody else has preceded us on that path, and it's a wrong assumption. Let me just say very briefly, for those of you to whom the mention of the fundamental propositions is a bit weird and you don't know much about them because you've heard of the three objects of the Theosophical Society, and these three fundamental propositions are a bit vague. At the end of the proem of the Secret Doctrine, they are presented by Blavatsky. Now, and this is rather a tragedy in a way, because there are an enormous number of people who are so impatient when they've bought a book to get into it that they skip all the introductory pages and go straight for chapter 1. Now, if you do that with the Secret Doctrine, you have missed such a treat, because the proem at the start of the Secret Doctrine is an incredible read. It is an incredible read. And it's not as complicated to understand as the Secret Doctrine itself. It's a straightforward narrative presented by Blavatsky when she has set herself the aim on the title page itself to provide a synthesis between religion, philosophy and science. And she writes this proem in which she explains how she sees the problem, how she sees the task that she has undertaken in writing for this. And at the end of this poem, she presents these three fundamental propositions. Now, these propositions are really the basic rocks upon which the whole of the theological and philosophical basis of the theosophical doctrines are based and rest. And in the end, virtually everything refers back in some shape or form to these three fundamental propositions. Now, some of you know that backwards and inside out and upside down. Others may have not had it said that to you in that sort of form ever before. But whichever category you fall into, or halfway in between somewhere, it is always worth going back to read the three fundamental propositions because they are so important. However, the first fundamental proposition is so deep metaphysically that it's almost impenetrable. On top of that, it gets in a bit of a tangle by having to use words to describe something which is basically indescribable. And so this article, which Michael has included in his book by David Regal, is incredibly valuable. And I couldn't put it down when I started reading it during this week. It was so fantastic. And on this page 33, no less, it says, he puts down a slight rewording of this first fundamental proposition, which helps to make it a little bit more understandable, but only a little bit, because you really need to read the whole 12 pages of this article to see the full depth and meaning that lies behind this one statement that Blavatsky puts here in this fundamental proposition. And here it is with David's slight modification to make it a bit better to understand. There is an omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle, the one reality. This absolute, like the Parabrahm of Advaita Vedanta, is beyond the range and reach of thought. So is inconceivable and inexpressible. It cannot properly be referred to as being Rather, to coin a new term, it is beingness. It is without attributes and is essentially unrelated to manifest finite being. Yet, it is the rootless root, the causeless cause of all that was, is, or ever shall be. It's one of the most profound statements that I have ever read in my life. I mean, when I first read that, I was just, well, to use a crude phrase, I was gobsmacked. It's just so incredible. But I want to read you something at the very end of this article, which is a beautiful little sort of spotlight on this whole situation that I'm trying to develop in this morning's lecture. Because he says, with all the complexity that he's been going into, is in the end, it's a model, an intellectual model that we're talking about. This model, where the inherent nature of eternal matter is motion. The second numbered item could be stated: the motion of the one element produces a centre of energy, a germ or a seed. And then you go, etc., etc. So he goes on to say, since the one reality is inconceivable and inexpressible, which we've just been reading, whatever conceptual model we may use to describe it and its periodic manifestation, which is the second fundamental proposition, is still a model. A model that may lead towards the truth, as Blavatsky says, but is not the truth itself. Then he says, this does not, however, make such models any less important. The most widespread model of the source and origin of the universe is that of a creator God. According to the Mahatma K.H., belief in God and gods is the cause of 2/3 of the evils that pursue humanity. So our conceptual models do make a difference. Such a difference, in fact, that K.H. says about the God idea, our chief aim is to deliver humanity of this nightmare. It is not without importance, then, to refine our understanding of the conceptual models that Blavatsky and her teachers gave in its place. I suppose in the end, what we're talking about is an expansion of consciousness. I was going to bring a visual aid, but I've left it behind upstairs. I was going to say that in trying to understand this expansion of consciousness which is needed as we go deeper and deeper into this idea of unity and abandoning of our personal self and our identity as a personal self, we need to realise, and of course this is traditional language, that we are a tiny fragment of an infinite diversity that the whole cosmos is, as a manifestation of the one. But when it comes down to consciousness, it's even more difficult to get hold of it. And I was going to put my sunglasses on. And you have to imagine I've got my sunglasses on now, and I can only see you dimly with my very dark sunglasses on. I only have a very dim idea what you look like compared to what I have when I've got my glasses on. And this is really what St. Paul is saying when he says, now we see through a glass darkly. This feeling that there's an incredible something out there that we can actually get hold of and reach. but somehow it eludes us. Either because we can't see clearly enough, or because our consciousness hasn't reached the bandwidth, if you like, necessary to tune into it. That we need a huge expansion of consciousness in order to grasp the meaning of the voice of the silence. Now, I would suggest that one of the ways in which we achieve this huge expansion of consciousness is by looking at it in terms of silence, the world of deep silence. Because at each level of the stairway, you have to go to another level of silence. Yes, you can come into a meditation like we have here each morning at the school and sit in silence, physical silence. But each person sitting here in physical silence may have a whole world of activity going on inside their heads. Their imagination may be doing double time. And so the first challenge is to get to that level of silence where there's sufficient silence in the mind to become aware of the self. Now this is what happened to me that weekend. After my imagination had worn itself out with flooding me with interesting after interesting studies and thoughts and ideas and so on, gradually it started to subside. It took hours to do it, hours and hours to do it. But eventually it reached a point where I was silent. The imagination had had its fill, and it was prepared to calm down. And it was only at that point that I became aware of the self. And that is just an illustration of a process that goes on and on and on in our lives. And there are some people who haven't started the process, who aren't really aware of themselves, spelt with the capital letters. And they're only aware of themselves in the level of their personality and their physical bodies. And so all this teaching about the path is just a bit of academia as far as they're concerned, because they haven't begun to tread the path in the true sense that Blavatsky is talking about. And until we actually are wanting to tread the path, we won't tread the path. There's no way you can force yourself to tread the path that you don't want to tread. Sooner or later, hopefully sooner, or even later, better than not at all, you embark upon the path. You decide you want, like Pilgrim in Pilgrim's Progress, that you want to leave the world of sorrow, and that you want to tread the path, cross the Antakarana bridge. But it's a path you have to tread in deep silence. One of the things that you're always asked to do when there's a service on in church is to keep silent. Because it's a very precious path. It's not a path for the profane, or for the cynical, or for the unbelieving. It's a path that can only be trod by those who are treading it with the utmost seriousness and the most deep spiritual intent. And so, a lot of people are, of course, afraid of silence. Many young people are afraid of silence. They want the noise jangling in their ears all the time, lest hearing they might hear and seeing they might understand. There is this huge desire to block out the possibility that there might be a world out there to be accessed by through the road that leads to the deep silence. In fact, the voice of the silence really sums it all up. in these incredible words in number 200, the verse number 200, where it says, "Thou canst not travel on the path until thou hast become the path itself." And that is such an incredibly, almost abstruse statement that contains within it the actual reality of this whole business of treading the path and finding our true selves and coming to terms with our true selves. And of course the other thing about becoming the path is, I think it's shorthand for becoming totally identified with the path. It needs elaboration, doesn't it, that statement? It's too trite. I mean, what does it mean when it says you have to become the path? You have to become so identified with the path that it is actually possible to tread along it. If you don't reach that point of identification with it, then you can't traverse the path. And in the end, I'm sure that you will almost feel in this talk this morning the total inadequacy of words. Whether I've used poetry, whether I've used quotations, whatever I've used, there is something here that is so deep and at the very heart of esotericism that it is beyond words. And yet it is there as a total reality. In fact, it is the ultimate reality, as has already been said in the quotations that I've read to you this morning. Well, I've had my hour, or now the best part of it, but I may hopefully have stimulated some thoughts, and perhaps I've stimulated you to buy this book that Michael has so kindly brought with him to the school and donated to the school, because it has got some fantastic stuff in it. And even if you only buy it for this one analysis of the first fundamental proposition, there are all sorts of goodies here, and they've been specially selected, as I say, to honour this man, Ted Davey, but they are a wonderful read, each of them, and I do recommend you to take a look at it with a view to buying it. Well, thank you all very much for listening so intently and so beautifully to that talk. I wonder whether anybody wants to make any statements or ask any questions before we close. Yes, Crystal.
Thank you very much, Colin, for this very profound exposition. It came to my mind, thinking of the Bhagavad Gita, it also points out the path, and it suggests several yogas. And the first yoga is mentioned is Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. And that is what theosophy really is, isn't it? It's the yoga of knowledge, and it's the first one. We need to know about it before we can do anything else. The second yoga is then Karma Yoga, which is yoga of service, of action. And the third is Bhakti Yoga, which is Christianity, isn't it?
Well, it's the yoga of worship.
Of worship, yes, which is
really,
religion.
Yes, but Raja Yoga is really the one that it's all leading to.
That's right.
The final one is Raja Yoga, which
Yes.
is the yoga of the divine, of the true spiritual understanding.
And there's another statement, the halls you mentioned. The second hall, this is the hall of learning, isn't it? And the hall, a snake under each flower.
Under each flower, yes.
And it's so graphic, it's so fantastic, and it alludes to the illusion, to the glamour of the world, of everything you find there in the astral world. Not to be deceived by it.
It was a very difficult talk to put together, Crystal, because it wove together the concept of consciousness and the concepts of progression through a path.
But you got it across beautifully.
Thank you, thank you. Anybody else want to say anything?